Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going deep into the LAPD manual.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, the huge document with all the rules and regs for LAPD officers.
Yeah.
We're not trying to make you experts
Right.
or have you memorize it all, but we want to help you understand the why behind these procedures.
It's really fascinating how this manual isn't just a dry list of rules.
Yeah.
It actually gives us a glimpse into the values and priorities of the LAPD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to go beyond just listing what's in there and really dig into what it tells us about the LAPD, how
Yeah.
they operate, and how they interact with the city. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Okay. So when you think LAPD, you probably picture those high-speed chases and dramatic arrests,
Oh, yeah, the Hollywood stuff.
like on TV,
Yeah.
right? But the manual covers so much more than just catching bad guys. What surprised you when you first looked at this thing?
Honestly, one thing that stood out to me was how detailed they are about interacting with different communities. Like, there are specific guidelines for police contact with persons experiencing homelessness.
Wow.
And these guidelines really emphasize treating everyone with respect and dignity.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. And it's not
Hmm.
just being polite. The manual actually talks about connecting people with resources
Right.
and avoiding unnecessary criminalization. It seems like they're trying to go beyond just responding to calls
Yeah.
and actually address some of the root causes of the issues.
Exactly. And it's not just homelessness either.
Right.
There are instructions for using the Next Talk TTY app
Yeah.
to communicate with people who are hearing impaired.
Wow, that's impressive. Just they're really thinking about inclusivity,
Yeah.
making sure they can communicate with everyone they encounter.
Absolutely. It makes you think about how much planning goes into something we might take for granted,
Right.
like talking to someone who's deaf or hard of hearing.
You know, another thing that stuck out to me was all those codes they use.
Oh, yeah.
Code 3, Code 4, all that stuff.
Mhm.
I always thought those were just made up for TV. But the manual actually defines what each code means and how they're used.
Yeah, it's a really efficient way for them to communicate quickly during emergencies.
Yeah,
Code 3 means lights and sirens, full speed ahead.
got it.
Code 4 means everything's under control.
So it's like their own secret language.
Right.
I guess when things get crazy, they need to communicate quickly and clearly. It's cool to see how they've thought through all these details.
Absolutely.
Now, remember how we were talking about the LAPD doing more than just typical police work?
Yeah.
The manual goes into that too.
Oh, yeah. It covers everything from managing film permits
Yeah.
to securing those abandoned buildings you see boarded up around town.
Right. It even talks about what to do if they get a report of a missing aircraft.
Wow.
Missing aircraft, that's not something you see every day.
It really highlights how their responsibilities go so far beyond just dealing with crime. They're involved in all sorts of things that affect the city and its residents.
Okay, now for the fun part, I found some really intriguing details in the manual. Did you know there's a whole procedure for renumbering firearms that don't have serial numbers?
That's interesting. What's fascinating about that is it shows how seriously they take firearm tracing.
Right.
Even if a gun's missing its original markings, they have a way to track it.
It's like detective work, but for guns.
Yeah.
Now, this one really made me think. The manual talks about when officers can ask for someone's place of birth during an arrest.
Yeah.
It seems super specific.
Oh, that one stood out to me as well. They only ask for that information in very particular situations.
Okay.
It shows a real awareness of privacy concerns.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to balance gathering information with respecting people's rights.
Right.
Okay, I know we've all heard of bomb threats,
Mm.
but I never really thought about the procedures for handling them.
Especially in a city like Los Angeles, it makes sense that they'd have detailed protocols for those kinds of threats.
Yeah.
The manual even outlines who needs to be notified, like the Area Detective Division Watch Commander.
Right.
And it triggers a whole chain of responses,
Yeah.
from bomb-sniffing dogs to the bomb squad. They're not messing around.
It's reassuring to know they're taking these threats seriously
Yeah.
and have a clear plan in place.
It also speaks to the importance of communication and coordination
Right.
in those high-pressure situations.
And here's another interesting detail. The manual is super specific about how they handle evidence,
Oh, yeah.
especially drugs.
Especially with larger quantities.
Right.
The manual even says to use cardboard boxes for amounts over a kilogram.
Cardboard boxes.
Yeah.
I guess they need something sturdy. It's interesting how they've thought through every little detail.
Right down to the type of container.
Yeah. And that's not all. They've got very specific guidelines for taser use, too.
Oh, yeah, tasers. The manual's very clear about when they can be used,
Right.
how they're reported, and the training involved.
Yeah,
They really emphasize transparency and accountability with the use of force.
that makes sense. It's not just about having the tool, it's about using it responsibly and documenting everything.
Exactly.
And speaking of accountability, that seems to be a major theme throughout the whole manual.
Absolutely. There are whole sections dedicated to reporting use of force,
Right.
handling evidence correctly,
Yeah.
and even investigating deaths that happen in police custody.
Wow.
They're not shying away from those tough topics.
I was really struck by that. It shows they're trying to be open and transparent,
Mm.
which I think is really important for building public trust.
It's not just about enforcing the law.
Yeah.
It's also about holding themselves to a high standard.
Right. Now, this next part might sound a little strange, but it really caught my attention. What happens if an officer encounters a DUI situation,
Okay.
but it involves a diplomat?
Ooh, that's where things get tricky.
Right.
It raises all sorts of questions about diplomatic immunity and how those situations are handled.
Right.
It's fascinating to see how those procedures reflect that delicate balance between law enforcement and international relations.
Yeah, you never would have thought about that. Right.
And remember how we were talking about those really specific details?
Uh-huh.
Well, get this. They even have different procedures for handling safe and sane fireworks
Why?
versus the dangerous kind. Who knew?
It just goes to show they need to be prepared for all sorts of scenarios,
Yeah.
even ones that seem a bit quirky.
Right, from the everyday to the unexpected. They've got procedures for it all. It's pretty impressive, actually. And here's another one that I found really thought-provoking. They have different procedures depending on whether a bomb threat comes from a school or somewhere else.
That makes sense, though, right?
Yeah.
A bomb threat at a school with all those kids is going to need a much faster and more intense response.
Right. It's like they've really thought through all these different scenarios and tailored their procedures to each specific context.
Yeah, it really highlights how much thought goes into a manual like this. It's not just a bunch of rules thrown together.
Yeah.
It's a carefully crafted system. Okay, before we move on, there's one more thing about accountability I want to mention.
Right.
They don't just investigate deaths in custody.
Right.
They also investigate deaths that happen in their own jails.
That's a really important point. It shows they're committed to transparency.
Yeah.
Even when dealing with deaths in their own facilities, they don't just rely on the jail's account.
Right.
They conduct their own independent investigation to get to the bottom of what happened.
It's like they're holding themselves accountable at every level.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive, right?
Right? Absolutely. And essential for maintaining public trust.
Okay.
Now, we talked about how they interact with people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
But they also have specific procedures for suspected elder or dependent adult abuse.
Oh, yeah. That's another area where they're dealing with a really vulnerable population.
Right. And it's not just about responding to the immediate situation. They also have to coordinate with agencies like Adult Protective Services.
Right.
To make sure those folks are safe in the long run. It shows their commitment to protecting everyone in the community.
It really highlights that police work is about more than just chasing criminals.
Absolutely.
It's about ensuring everyone's well-being.
Right.
Okay, so this next one might seem a little strange, but it really caught my eye. The teletype.
The teletype. It might seem like a relic of the past,
I know.
but it's still used for some critical function.
I know. It's like something out of an old movie.
I know, right?
But they actually have specific instructions for using it.
yeah.
Like a specific format for notifications related to show-up appearances.
Oh, wow. Those are basically like real-life lineups
Right.
where a witness or victim tries to identify a suspect.
Wow. It's amazing to see how these older technologies are still in use. Okay, this last one really made me laugh. They have procedures for placing local phone calls.
I know it sounds ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But it highlights their need to be efficient and accountable,
Yeah.
even with something as simple as making a phone call.
I guess every detail matters when you're running a huge organization like the LAPD. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah, we have.
but I'm curious, what are some of the bigger themes or values that you see emerging from all these procedures? What does this manual tell us about the LAPD's overall philosophy?
One of the things that jumps out at me is the focus on transparency and accountability.
Yeah, we've seen that in so many areas. Reporting use of force,
Right.
handling evidence, investigating deaths in custody.
Yeah.
It seems like they're really trying to be more open and hold themselves to a higher standard.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just those specific incidents.
Yep.
They also have detailed procedures for handling complaints from citizens
Right.
and allegations of misconduct. It
Yeah.
shows they're taking those matters seriously and want to deal with them fairly.
It's not just about punishing wrongdoers.
Right?
It's about identifying areas for improvement and building trust with the community.
Exactly. Another theme I see running through the manual is a commitment to inclusivity.
Yeah, we talked about that with the procedures for interacting with people who are deaf or hard of hearing
Right.
and individuals experiencing homelessness. Are there other examples?
Absolutely. Take their guidelines for investigating hate crimes, for instance.
Okay.
They really stress the importance of identifying bias motivations
Yeah.
and taking appropriate action.
Right.
It shows they recognize the impact these crimes have on certain communities,
Yeah.
and they're committed to protecting everyone.
And they even have a dedicated hate crime coordinator in each command
Right.
to make sure these cases are handled properly.
Exactly. It's a clear sign that they want to create a safe and welcoming environment for all Angelinos,
Right.
regardless of their background or beliefs.
Yeah. Now, here's one that really stood out to me. Protecting witnesses and victims.
Oh, yeah. The manual actually outlines procedures for responding to threats against people who are going to testify in court.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to make sure people feel safe coming forward
Right.
and participating in the justice system.
Yeah. It's a crucial part of upholding the whole system.
Right.
If people are afraid to testify, it's really hard to hold criminals accountable.
Exactly.
It's really about empowering people to speak up without fear of reprisal.
Absolutely.
You know, it's amazing how much responsibility the LAPD has. We've talked about everything from traffic collisions to hate crimes,
There's a lot.
from missing persons reports to film permits.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah. And the manual reflects that complexity.
Yeah.
It's like a blueprint for managing a massive and diverse city like Los Angeles. Okay, let's dive back into some of those intriguing details. One thing that surprised me was how they handle situations involving people with mental illness.
Yeah. The manual outlines specific steps for contacting the mental evaluation unit,
Right.
getting people to the right facilities,
Yeah.
and ensuring their safety throughout the whole process.
It's a really sensitive situation, and they seem to have given it a lot of thought.
It is.
And they also have guidelines for situations where there are concerns about someone having a weapon.
Right. It's a tough balance trying to protect both the individual and the public.
Definitely. And what about those situations where officers encounter someone suspected of being in the country illegally?
That's a complex area. The manual talks about contacting the immigration liaison officer
Okay.
and following specific procedures to make sure they're in line with federal immigration laws
Right.
while also respecting people's rights.
It's a sensitive issue, and it seems like they're trying to navigate it carefully.
Definitely.
Okay, one last detail before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. The manual outlines guidelines for handling requests from immigrant victims of serious crimes,
Okay.
specifically for the U visa.
The U visa is a special visa that allows victims of certain crimes to stay in the U.S.
Right.
if they cooperate with law enforcement.
It's really about protecting vulnerable people
Yeah,
and encouraging them to come forward without fear of deportation.
exactly. It shows they recognize the specific challenges faced by immigrant victims
Mm.
and are trying to help them access legal protections.
It's another example of their commitment to working with diverse communities
Yeah.
and making sure everyone has access to justice.
Absolutely.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into the LAPD manual.
We have.
We've gone beyond just listing procedures and really started to explore what this document tells us about the LAPD's values,
Yes.
priorities, and the complexities of their work.
Right.
We've seen how they try to balance law enforcement with community engagement,
Absolutely.
inclusivity, and accountability.
Definitely.
And we've discovered some fascinating details about how they handle everything from missing aircraft to bomb threats,
Yeah.
from tasers to teletypes.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. Before we move on to part two,
Mm.
we want to hear from you. What's standing out to you so far? What surprised you the most? What questions are you left with? We'll be back in just a moment to continue our exploration of the LAPD manual, so don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the LAPD manual. Before we jump back in, think about what surprised you most about what we've uncovered so far. I know I was fascinated by how much detail there is in some of these procedures. Did you know they have pages and pages dedicated to dealing with lost property?
Oh yeah, totally. Lost wallets, stray dogs, bicycles. They even have procedures for lost aircraft.
It's crazy, right? But it shows how seriously they take their job of reuniting people with their stuff. They get that lost property can have sentimental value, not just money.
It's not just about finding the owner, though, right? The manual outlines guidelines for storing the property,
Yeah.
figuring out how much it's worth, and even how to get rid of it if they can't find the owner.
Right. It reminds you that even something simple can get pretty complicated when you're dealing with the amount of stuff that gets lost in LA. Okay, ready for something a bit more intense. Let's talk about vehicle pursuits.
Oh, yeah. Those high-speed chases always look so dramatic in movies. What's the manual say about those?
It outlines a whole bunch of guidelines for when they can start a chase, how they should handle it, and even when they need to stop it. Safety is a big deal, of course.
Makes sense?
Yeah.
You don't want officers putting themselves or anyone else in danger?
Exactly. The manual says they have to constantly assess the risk, talk to their supervisors, and stick to strict safety rules. It's not just a wild goose chase.
I bet it's not just the officers in the chase either. Other units in the area need to know what's going on, too.
Absolutely. There are instructions for other units to stay out of the chase route, but to keep track of where it's going, it's all about coordinating so everyone stays safe.
It's like a dance, even though it's happening so fast. And get this. There's even a procedure for what happens when a chase that started in another city comes into LA.
That's a good point. It shows how important it is for different police departments to work together. You don't want things to get confusing or dangerous just because you crossed a city line.
Right. It's like the LAPD doesn't work alone. They have to work with all kinds of other agencies.
Okay, let's change gears. We talked about bomb threats before, but I wanted to look closer at the procedures in the manual.
You mean when someone calls in a threat?
Right, exactly. The manual is super detailed about this. It outlines steps for checking out the threat, getting people out of there, and doing a really thorough search.
I bet they have to work quickly in those situations.
Absolutely. Time is super important. And the manual gives clear instructions on how different teams should work together. You might have bomb-sniffing dogs, the bomb squad, and other experts, all working at the same time.
Wow. And it's not just about finding a bomb, right? They also have procedures for trying to talk to the person making the threat.
Yes. They might try to get them to stop peacefully, get more information about the threat, and of course, try to gather evidence if they need to prosecute someone later. It's a multi-pronged approach.
It's cool to see how they try to stay in control and follow procedures, even in the middle of all that chaos. So far, we've mainly talked about the LAPD working with individuals. What about businesses? Does the manual talk about that?
It does. It mentions something called the Conditional Use Permit, or CUP. It's basically a way to regulate businesses that might be causing trouble for the neighborhood.
What kind of trouble?
Think about things like too much noise, illegal stuff going on, or other things that disrupt the peace. The manual has a whole process for giving out, changing, or even taking away these permits.
It sounds like they're trying to balance the needs of businesses with keeping the peace in the community.
Exactly. They're not trying to shut businesses down. They have procedures for talking things out, negotiating, and finding compromises. The goal is to find solutions that address community concerns while also letting businesses do well.
It's a reminder that the LAPD isn't just about enforcing the law. They're also involved in keeping things running smoothly in neighborhoods. Now, we talked about this a little bit already, but I want to learn more about how the LAPD works with the legal system.
It's complicated for sure. The LAPD doesn't just arrest people. They're also a big part of making sure people are prosecuted for crimes.
Right. They work with prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, the whole legal system.
Exactly. The manual outlines procedures for filing complaints, getting warrants, and even bringing evidence to court. They have to make sure everything is done correctly and follows the law.
It's like a dance between law enforcement and the courts. And speaking of complicated stuff, how does the LAPD handle situations with people from other countries?
That's interesting. The manual says they have to tell foreign consulates when one of their citizens is arrested or detained.
That makes sense. Those situations could be a big deal internationally.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that the LAPD has to think about what's going on in the rest of the world. They have to follow international rules and make sure people from other countries are treated fairly and their rights are respected.
It's amazing how many different things they have to think about.
Okay.
Let's talk about something that's sadly become more common: active shooter situations.
This is one area where the LAPD manual has changed a lot in recent years. They've really shifted their approach to focus on taking action right away to stop the threat and save lives.
It's different from the old way of waiting for SWAT teams to get there.
Right, they know that every second counts. The manual also emphasizes working together with other agencies, because these situations often involve lots of different groups responding.
Right, it's like they're always learning from what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
and changing their procedures to deal with new problems.
Now let's step into a world that's often pretty mysterious. Undercover operations.
Ooh, undercover work.
No.
That always sounds so cool.
The manual actually gives us a little peek into that world, outlining procedures for things like stakeout surveillance and other undercover stuff.
I bet safety is a top priority in those situations.
Absolutely. The manual stresses the importance of planning, getting permission, and making sure everyone involved knows their job. They also have procedures for managing informants and dealing with situations where an operation is compromised.
It sounds like a high-stakes game with lots of moving parts.
It is. And speaking of moving parts, how does the LAPD make sure its officers have all the gear they need to do their jobs?
Good question. I mean, they need everything from uniforms to guns to, well,
The manual has detailed procedures for giving out and maintaining equipment. It covers everything from basic uniforms and belts to firearms, radios, and even body armor.
it's a reminder that they're dealing with some pretty dangerous situations and they need the right equipment to stay safe.
And it's not just about safety gear. They also have procedures for things like gas cards to make sure officers can fill up their cars and keep patrolling without having to stop.
It's all about keeping things moving. Literally, okay, we can't talk about the LAPD manual without mentioning Hollywood, right?
Of course, this is the City of Angels after all. The manual has a whole section about procedures for issuing permits for filming movies and TV shows.
Makes sense. LA is a huge center for entertainment and they film all over the city.
Exactly. The manual has guidelines for managing traffic, keeping people safe,
Yeah.
and even approving the use of guns on set.
Hold on. Proving guns on set. That sounds tricky.
It is. They have to make sure those guns are handled safely and only used for filming.
It's like a whole other level of responsibility for them. It shows how the LAPD works in a unique environment, where it's not always clear what's real and what's just for show.
All right, we've covered a lot in this part of our deep dive. We've seen how the LAPD handles everything from lost items to high-speed chases, from bomb threats to undercover work, from working with businesses to navigating the legal system.
It's clear that the LAPD manual is a lot more than just a bunch of rules. It shows what the department values, what they prioritize, and how complicated their job really is.
And it's constantly being updated to face new problems and adapt to change.
Before we go to the last part of our deep dive, think about what really stood out to you in this section. What surprised you? What new things have you learned about the LAPD and what they do in the city?
Welcome back to our deep dive. As we wrap up our look at the LAPD manual, let's focus on three main things: how they handle evidence, the process of investigating crimes, and how they interact with specific communities in LA.
Okay, evidence is obviously super important in any police investigation, right?
Yeah.
It helps them solve crimes and hold people accountable. So how does the LAPD make sure evidence is handled properly and doesn't get messed up?
You're right. The integrity of evidence is key. The manual has super detailed procedures for collecting packaging and storing evidence. It has specific rules for all sorts of evidence: fingerprints, firearms, DNA, drugs, you name it. They have a process for it.
It's like a delicate operation, making sure everything is preserved perfectly.
Exactly. And it's not just about keeping the evidence clean. They also need to maintain a clear chain of custody. That means tracking every single person who touches the evidence, when they touched it, and why. They do this to make sure everything is accounted for and to prevent any questions about tampering or contamination.
Makes sense. You don't want any doubt about whether the evidence is legit.
Right. Now, once they've collected the evidence, that's when the investigation really gets going. The LAPD manual has different approaches for investigating based on the type of crime. A murder investigation is going to be very different from a theft investigation, for example.
So they have different plans for different situations.
Exactly. And the manual goes into detail about which special units would get involved, how they work with the regular patrol officers, and the exact steps they take to make sure the investigation is thorough. For example, a homicide might involve the robbery-homicide division, while a cybercrime might bring in their digital forensics team.
So they have a whole team of specialists ready to take on anything.
They do. And the manual also sets timelines for certain actions, like interviewing witnesses or getting evidence analyzed at the lab. They understand that delays can mess up an investigation and could even prevent justice from being served.
It's a tough balance,
Okay.
making sure everything is done right. But also, quickly, we've talked about how they deal with specific communities, like people experiencing homelessness. Are there other groups the LAPD manual focuses on?
Absolutely. One that stands out is the LGBTQ plus community. The manual has a whole section on how to interact with LGBTQ plus people. It stresses the importance of respect, sensitivity, and using the right language.
It sounds like they're trying to be aware of the discrimination and prejudice that this community has faced.
Right. They want to build trust and ensure that everyone is treated fairly. And it's not just about words. They also have specific ways to investigate hate crimes that are directed at LGBTQ plus individuals because they recognize these crimes can be especially harmful.
It's about recognizing that different communities have different needs and challenges.
Exactly. Another group with specific procedures in the manual is the gang community.
That's a tough one. Gang violence is a big issue in Los Angeles, but there's also the risk of bias and profiling when police are dealing with gangs.
You're right, and the manual addresses that.
Hmm.
It says they need to use objective criteria when figuring out who is a gang member and who isn't, using evidence and avoiding stereotypes.
So it's not about just rounding up anyone who looks like they might be in a gang.
No, not at all. The manual also talks about working with groups in the community to prevent gang violence through outreach programs and intervention efforts. They recognize that police can't solve this problem alone. They need help from people in the community to get to the root of the issue.
It reminds us that sometimes the best way to police is to prevent crime in the first place, not just react to it. Speaking of accountability, the manual also lays out a very specific process for handling complaints against officers.
That's so important for keeping the public's trust. Every organization needs a way to deal with concerns and hold its members accountable, and that includes the LAPD.
So what's that process like?
The manual details how to receive, investigate, and make decisions about complaints against officers. It emphasizes being fair, thorough, and committed to finding and addressing any wrongdoing.
And I guess there are things in place to protect both the person making the complaint and the officer being accused.
Right. Of course. The process is designed to be unbiased and protect everyone involved. It shows that the LAPD is committed to holding itself to the highest standards.
And that being transparent is key to building a good relationship with the community.
Exactly. One last thing I want to mention is LA's diverse immigrant population. The LAPD manual has special procedures for interacting with immigrant communities, recognizing their unique needs and concerns.
That makes sense. LA has so many cultures and languages. I imagine that creates some challenges for law enforcement.
It does. For example, the manual outlines ways to get translation services, to communicate effectively with people who don't speak much English. They also have rules for working with undocumented immigrants, making sure they're treated with respect and their rights are protected.
It's all about making sure everyone feels safe, regardless of their immigration status.
Right. Los Angeles is a city built by immigrants, and the LAPD wants to build trust and relationships with all members of the community.
So after spending all this time with the LAPD manual, what are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that the LAPD manual is so much more than just a bunch of rules. It gives us a look into the values of the department, what they think is important, and how complicated their job really is. It shows their dedication to serving everyone in Los Angeles, from protecting the rights of the LGBTQ plus community to working with immigrants.
It also reminds us that the LAPD is always changing, learning from the past and trying to get better. They're not perfect, but they're putting in the effort to gain the community's trust and make the city safer for everyone.
And don't forget, the LAPD manual is a public document. You can find it online and check it out for yourself. I encourage you to do that and see how much detail goes into every part of what they do.
It's a fascinating read, even if you're not a police expert.
It is, and it can give you a much better understanding of the role the LAPD plays in our city.
That wraps up our deep dive into the LAPD manual. We hope you learned something new, and maybe we're even a little surprised by what we found.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive, where we'll be exploring another fascinating topic.